So let's talk more specifically about the box squat. A lot of the information on the box squat comes from the powerlifting community, and it's actually very, very useful. But what I want to do is look at it from a little bit different perspective. We're going to look at it more from the inside out in regard to how we actually use the guts to our advantage, how we can be disadvantaged by them if we don't learn how to control them, and then how the pelvic diaphragm actually influences your ability to perform the squat. So one of the things that we have to recognize is that we can use this in a number of situations, from rehabilitation to performance. It's this versatility that makes me a huge fan of the box squat. But I think that if we start to see some of the representations as to how we're able to manipulate the variables of the box squat, you'll see its utility. So let's do a quick review of how the pelvis behaves during a squat. So as I start with this hip at a relative 0 degrees of hip flexion or hip extension, depending on how you look at it, I'm going to say that the pelvis is in a relatively inhaled position. So as I'm descending in the squat and I pass through this 90-degree range, this is going to be where I achieve a concentric pelvic diaphragm. So I'm moving from an inhalation to an exhalation, and then as I increase the depth of the squat, I'm going to move back towards a more inhaled position, relatively speaking, inside the pelvis. So again, I'm going to get diaphragm descension. So basically what I'm looking at from parallel to the deep squat is I'm looking at the pelvic diaphragm descension as a representation of how much hip range of motion I have. The advantage of the box is that it creates a constraint. So it's actually going to help me control this descent of the pelvic diaphragm, because if I limit the descent, I can actually learn how to reduce the descent of the pelvic diaphragm, so I can actually reduce its eccentric orientation. It's this concentric orientation of the pelvic diaphragm that allows me to be strong and explosive. But I can also manipulate the pelvic diaphragm in situations where I may have too much concentric activity and I need eccentric orientation to allow me to capture ranges of motion. So this is one of the reasons why I truly love the box squat, because it is so versatile. So let's look at a number of variations and how we may utilize those in certain situations. So let's get a general representation of the box squat. So we're sitting down to a box and we're using that as a constraint to allow us to manipulate how the pelvic diaphragm is going to behave. So as soon as I sit onto the box, the pelvic diaphragm no longer moves. So if I have too much eccentric orientation, I can reduce that descension. If I have too much concentric orientation, I can actually get that muscle to yield as I sit down to the box if I deload my body weight onto the box. Now, one of the things that a lot of people don't recognize is the fact that there's also a spring-loaded mechanism internally that's associated with the behavior of the pelvic diaphragm. So if we use a trampoline as a representation, you've got the material of the trampoline itself, and then you've got the springs that attach to the frame. We can manipulate the stiffness of the material and we can manipulate the stiffness of the springs. And this is why we need a number of variations of the box squat, because what we're going to do is we're going to manipulate those factors of how the trampoline behaves and how the springs behave relative to one another to solve problems. As I sit down to the box and I deload my body weight onto the box, the trampoline is actually going to resist that force. The springs are going to absorb that force, absorb that energy, and that's what's going to allow me to propel myself upward off the box. Now, depending on how fast I sit down to the box and how fast I get off the box, I can actually manipulate where I emphasize the load and the stress and the adaptation. So if I want to make the trampoline stiffer, what I need to do is deload my body weight to the box and allow some of the elastic energy to actually dissipate from the spring element. Then I'm dependent on a concentric orientation and an overcoming action of the pelvic diaphragm to allow me to stand back up. So if I want to emphasize the spring mechanism, which includes the connective tissues and the skeleton itself, I want to shorten the amount of time that I'm spending on the box. So in this case, I may want to use a touch and go, which will create a stronger emphasis on the spring recoil that allows me to go off the box. Now let's consider problem number one. I have an eccentrically oriented pelvic diaphragm and I have difficulty capturing concentric orientation. So one of the representations you'll often see, and we'll see this especially in females, as they jump from a box down to the ground, you'll see the knees move towards one another as they try to slow their descent. This is somebody that has a great deal of difficulty reducing the eccentric orientation, creating an overcoming contraction, and slowing their descent quickly. So in this case, I have someone that has trouble creating the concentric orientation of the pelvic diaphragm. So we'll start them at the transition with a high box squat. So we set the height a little bit above or a little bit below this transition point where the squat becomes a little bit more difficult for them, but it's still above parallel. So we're just transitioning into that sticking point. So at this transition point in the high box squat, I can stop the descent of that eccentrically orienting pelvic diaphragm. Using a strong exhalation strategy to get off the box helps me emphasize the overcoming element, and then it just becomes a matter of slowly reducing the box height. One of the best ways to make the transition from a higher box to a lower box is to dampen the forces associated with sitting down onto the box. And we can do that with a series of pads that will help dampen those forces. As the athlete becomes more successful in their acceleration off the box, we simply lower the level of padding. This makes it a little bit more challenging. It teaches them to hang on to that concentric orientation and allows them to increase the internal pressure or the exhalation strategy that's going to allow them to propel themselves upwards. One of the things we have to recognize about the box squat is that as we sit down to the box, there's a slight delay in the way that the guts fall towards the pelvic diaphragm. So the body moves downward, the guts actually move up and then come downward. So there's a downward acceleration of the guts. If I'm already too eccentrically oriented and I can't capture that concentric orientation of the pelvic diaphragm, one of the ways that I can reduce that downward force is to use the reverse Bandbox squat. So by reducing the systemic load with the reverse band tension, I can actually reduce the internal forces associated with the downward acceleration of the guts. This makes it easier for me to capture concentric orientation and the overcoming action of the pelvic diaphragm. This would be like making the material of the trampoline stiffer. If you've ever had an athlete that's been described as having heavy feet, or they're having trouble increasing their vertical jump with traditional means and methods, this reverse band tension allows them to learn to manage the internal forces more effectively. So rather than getting pushed into the ground with higher forces, they're actually able to reverse the internal forces and improve their upward propulsive capabilities. So much like adding weight to the bar under normal circumstances, what you're going to do over time is actually just reduce the amount of band tension. Another unique variation that's useful for those people that are having trouble getting off the ground is the rebound box squat. By hanging the weights from the band resistance as you propel yourself up off the box, the weights create a delay, much like the guts pressing down on the pelvic diaphragm. This is like loading the springs of the trampoline and allows them to propel themselves up off the box rather quickly. A word to the wise as you set this up, make sure that you dissipate all the swing on the weights before you try to get up off the box. This activity makes a great transition to our final representation, which is the banded box squat. Now, instead of deloading the internal forces, what we're going to do is we're going to magnify those forces with the downward pull of the band resistance. So we're accelerating the entire system towards the box, which is going to increase the amount of force directly into the pelvic diaphragm. Under these circumstances, I'm increasing the stiffness of the trampoline and the springs. So I'm trying to maximize the force production as I propel myself off the box. While it seems that all of these variations are ideal for athletes, we can also use a similar progression for our rehabilitation clients. Maximum force capabilities may not be needed, but we can still use the same strategies. Please keep in mind that these are not the only variations of the box squat that can be useful. But once you understand the principles of how we're applying this to the internal forces, the versatility of the box squat is only limited by your imagination. If you have any questions about the box squat or any other exercise for that matter, please send them to askbillhartman@gmail.com or follow up with me on Instagram or in the comments below.